Today's topic is the battle within. May sound a bit elusive, somewhat abstract when we look at the title. But very soon we will realize that this is a matter of our everyday experience. Very often we feel locked in a struggle with ourselves. We want to do certain things in a certain way. We are not able to do it. We are not able to regulate the function of our mind, though we are able to regulate the function of a very complicated high-tech machine. If suppose we decide, we take a decision that we will do a certain thing in a certain way tomorrow, we can never be sure that we will be able to do it that way. We may be able to do, but we can never be 100% certain about it. The way we could be sure about the way a machine in our hand will work next moment. And this problem is sometimes dealt with very elaborately in psychology, in psychiatry, and much more elaborately in the lives of great spiritual seekers. In fact, this problem becomes much more acute, much more serious in spiritual life than in any other area of life. But in psychiatry, perhaps this problem could be solved, at least temporarily. But in real life, there seems to be no solution. So there is a great statement attributed to St. Paul, where he writes, "I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." Long before St. Paul wrote these words, Arjuna, the student of Bhagavad Gita, put this question to Krishna. The question is this: Athakena prayuktoyam papam charadi purushaha anichan napi vashneya baladiva niyojitaha. Arjuna goes a bit deeper. Arjuna asked this question at the beginning of the conversation between the disciple Arjuna and Krishna, the teacher. See, I do not want to do something undesirable, but I can't help doing that. I want to do something which is spiritually fruitful, useful, but I can't bring my mind to do it. And then he says, even though I do not want to do something undesirable, I feel as if a mysterious hidden force is compelling me to do that very thing which I am trying not to do. Anichannapi vashneya. Bala means by force. I don't want it, but still I feel as if I'm compelled by an inner invisible force to do a thing which I am trying hard not to do. Krishna's answer is somewhat philosophical, but we will not go very deep into these philosophical aspects. Kama yesha krodha yesha rajoguna samudbhava. This is a simple language. Desire, anger, and greed, hatred, jealousy, all these are implied. These are some of the psychological forces which prevent you from doing the noble deed that you want to do, and which pursued you to do something ignoble which you want not to do. Now, this internal struggle, the struggle between mind and intellect, is very elaborately dealt with in the Vedantic spiritual literature. I shall introduce you into this subject from another angle. Sometimes we listen to a very grand idea, maybe in a Sunday lecture, or in a church congregation, or in a prayer meeting, or in a retreat, or when you read a holy book like the Gita or the Bible or any such great ennobling work. We feel this is a very grand, a very great idea, which I should put into action. So I should start a new chapter in my life. Very often we feel, when you read the Sermon on the Mount or the Gita or the Upanishads, or when you read the Gospel, where Sri Ramakrishna asked us, well, do work in this world, need not run away from this world, but once in a while, go to solitude, maybe the solitude of your own room in your own home, or to a temple or a prayer, church, or whatever may be, a place of worship, a place of contemplation, or maybe go to a holy man, fellow spiritual seekers, from whom you can learn, with whom you can discuss spiritual matters. Once in a while you should do that. You may be working in an office, in a factory or a university, working 13 hours a day, and enjoying that hyperactive way of life. But sometimes facing problems like depression and so on. When the banks collapse, share markets collapses, sometimes we feel upset. So Sri Ramakrishna says there is one solution. With one hand you do work in this world. With the other hand you touch the feet of the Lord. Put in another language, be engaged in our day-to-day duties and responsibilities. But at the same time, once in a while, think for yourself that there is something beyond, something higher. So go to a lonely place, practice some meditation or spiritual practices. This is what Sri Ramakrishna tells. And this is relevant, useful for all spiritual seekers. For the great mystics and also for the very common man or woman working in everyday life. Very relevant. So we read this, or we may read the Gospel of St. Luke or St. Mark or Matthew, whoever may be. But then immediately we forget. So intellect perceives the idea, we come to a strong decision, well, I shall certainly try to practice this great spiritual principle in my life. But immediately, mind takes over. So the intellectual conviction is pushed to the background, and the realities of everyday life take over, and we surrender ourselves to the whims and foibles of our own mind. So you can see the wide gap between where the intellect stands and where the mind stands. This is actually the battle between. The real battle, spiritual battle, for every spiritual seeker is the battle between intellect, which convinces, which gives us the conviction, the knowledge that we must do certain good, noble things. And a mind which prevents us from doing that. That's why St. Paul indirectly refers to this paradox within human psyche. Now, the problem is, we cannot control the mind the way we control gross entities. As I said earlier, the most complicated, the most sophisticated computer system could be regulated, activated in such a way that we can be 100% sure as to how it is going to function. But we can never be 100% sure as to how our own mind is going to function. Mind is a very subtle entity, much more abstract and much more subtle than the most advanced, complicated, subtle electronic gadgets. Now, Vedanta gives a number of solutions to bridge this gap between mind and intellect. One method, and the easiest method, that is prescribed is to keep our mind in a world of spiritually helpful, positive ideas. Mind needs food. If you don't give good food, it will eat poison, because it cannot keep quiet. Mind is defined in Vedanta as sankalpa vikalpatmika antakarana vrittihi. In fact, this battle within is indirectly a definition of what mind is all about in Vedanta. Sankalpa and vikalpa, conflicting thought currents facing each other. And modern psychologists like William James has defined mind as stream consciousness, an endless flow of thought currents. But Vedanta and yoga philosophy says it is true, it is an endless stream of thought currents, but there is not perfect continuity. There is sometimes a kind of internal struggle between two conflicting thought currents within the mind. And one thought current is what we call intellect. The other thought current is what we call mind proper. As I said, I gave the example, when we read a great spiritual book, when we listen to a great spiritual idea, or when we get some good instruction, you go to a library, read a wonderful book, suddenly you feel you have got a solution to some of the problems you are confronting. And then, you take a decision, I'm going to start a new life tomorrow. But when the tomorrow dawns upon us, mind takes over. What the intellect has grasped earlier is pushed to the background. Our old tendencies, what we call vasanas, vrittis, accumulated samskaras, all of them come back in a mighty tidal wave and take control of our life. So this problem is sometimes described, very graphically interpreted, as the struggle between the satanic forces and the divine forces in mystical literature. But there is an attempt to anthropomorphize this internal struggle. But Vedanta and yoga psychology, without giving a human dimension to these conflicting forces, tells us that this is natural and there is a way out, and the best way and the easiest way is to keep our mind engaged in positive thought currents. There are many ways. One method is, when you discuss, try to discuss spiritually helpful, positive topics. When you meet people, use some discrimination, what you call discerning wisdom. You should be a little choosy about the persons we associate with. Many people sometimes make these fatal blunders. See, Vedanta says Atman is everywhere. The same divine reality is everywhere. The immanent indweller in all beings. It is also the omnipresent or pervading reality. Then why should we see any difference between different human beings? Why should we be careful as to whom we associate ourselves with? It is all right for a Ramakrishna, for a Jesus, for a Buddha, or a Shankaracharya, or any of the great spiritual persons who have reached such an advanced level of spiritual growth and evolution that in their presence, other people will undergo a spiritual transformation. But before reaching that level, we should always exercise some discrimination. Discrimination means a discerning mind as to whom we associate with and whom we do not associate with. I shall give a graphic description, try to give a description of this problem based on two important verses in the ancient devotional classic, which is called Bhagavata Purana. You find this verse in the second chapter of 11th book in the Bhagavata Purana. I shall recite the verse and I shall try to explain in English. The verse is this: Sarva bhudeshu ya pasyet bhagavad bhavam atmanaha bhudani bhagavadi atmani esha bhagavadottamaha. Next verse says, Ishware tad adhineshu bariseshu dishatsucha prema maitri kripa upeksha yakkarodi samadhyamaha. These are the two verses. Now I will come to the explanation. The first verse tells us who is the highest devotee, the wisest spiritual seeker, an advanced spiritual aspirant. He is somebody like a Buddha or a Jesus or a Ramakrishna Paramahansa or any of these great spiritual personalities. They see the same divine principle everywhere. Everywhere they see the same reality. They experience the presence of the Lord in all human beings, and they experience the presence of the entire humanity in God. And they also experience the presence of this spiritual truth within their own inner self. But this is the position of the highest spiritual seeker. Those who have reached the highest mystical experience. Those who have got a spiritual power to transform a sinner into a saint. What about others? Common spiritual seekers. So this text comes down a few steps and then tells us we should be friendly. We must have constant interaction with fellow spiritual seekers. When different spiritual aspirants come together and discuss spiritual ideas, their spiritual life will be enriched, their faith will be strengthened, and their path becomes clear, and they feel confidence. They get the conviction that they are on the right track. It is a very encouraging, very inspiring experience when fellow spiritual seekers come together and discuss mutually beneficial topics related to spiritual life. And what about those who do not much care for spiritual values, who are ignorant of these things? We must try to help others. They are good people, but they are not interested in spiritual life. They do not have any negative ideas, but they do not much care for spiritual ideas. See, there are many great people in the world, good people rather, humanists. They never do anything wrong that's harmful to others. Maybe they are not conventional believers, either in religion, in God, or even in spirituality. But consciously, they never do anything that is unspiritual or non-spiritual. With such people, we must have interaction. We can try, make an effort to bring those people to the spiritual path. We must have devotion to God. We must have a sense of comradeship, friendliness with fellow spiritual seekers. We must discuss spiritual ideas with them. And we must try to introduce teach spiritual ideas to those who are good people, who are leading a good ethical life, who may not be interested in spirituality or religion. Then what about the last group? There are certain people who are absolutely negative. You tell them anything, oh, it's nothing, they would say. And in one Sanskrit verse, Vishayam Vishavatyaja, you must avoid such negative ideas and also people with such negative ideas as poison. Why is it so very important? If everything is Brahman, if God is all-pervading, why should we avoid certain people? Well, the reason is, right now, the idea that God is everywhere is only an intellectual conviction for us. It has not reached the mental level. Mind goes deeper, intellect is only skin deep. So, it's very important to remember that mind should be gradually elevated to the position of the intellectual conviction. Otherwise, you know what happens? We sometimes delude ourselves into believing that what we have understood intellectually has become a matter of real experience, which is not the truth. Many such people fall in spiritual track. This is a very important thing. So many great books like Ashtavakra Samhita, many such books which deal with Advaita philosophy, the idea of unity and oneness of creation. They expound these great ideas. In that case, well, there is God in Hitler also. There is God in Bin Laden also. There is God in all kinds of people whom we normally don't consider to be very spiritual. There is God in Buddha, Jesus also. What's the difference? The point is this. And then if you take such a view of life, there is always the great danger that when we associate, before we reach this real experience, before this intellectual conviction has become a matter of mental experience, if we associate ourselves with people who do not have a spiritual culture, who are always oriented towards a negative outlook in everything, there is every chance that instead of our converting them, they will convert us. Sometimes we feel, I can give an example. See, there's an interesting story in Buddha's life. Buddha was a great spiritual personality. Many people who came to him underwent a complete transformation. So there's an interesting story. One day he was traveling in the northwestern region of India. Today is Punjab, Haryana, etc. So he had to go through a forest path. There was a robber living in that area. And this robber had a very interesting hobby. He was a very cruel man, very evil, and his name was Anguli Mala. Now, Anguli means fingers of the hands. Mala means garlands. So his hobby was to ambush the wayfarers and kill them, cut off their fingers, and make garlands of those fingers and wearing them. That was his hobby. That was the type of man Angulimala was, an embodiment of cruelty and evil. In some books give a glimpse into his history. He became a psychopath, a criminal, due to some serious negative experiences he had to confront in the early part of his life. So he became a terrible, bloodthirsty robber and murderer. So Buddha was passing through that route. So some devotees, other bhikshus, Buddhist monks, gave him a strong warning: don't take this route. Here is an evil man living there. He will try to murder you and he will cut off your fingers, because he needs a regular supply of fresh fingers, So he has to keep himself very busy looking for new wayfarers and killing them and cutting down the fingers. So Buddha said, well, I don't bother about it. Buddha didn't care. He went on his way, and this robber appeared before Buddha. Buddha looked behind. The robber was following him. Buddha kept walking. The robber wanted to catch up with Buddha. Buddha was walking very slowly, but robber was running very fast, but the robber could not catch up with Buddha. And finally, this man became so tired and exhausted. Who are you? You are not afraid of me. You're walking so slowly, and I'm running so fast, and I'm not able to catch up with you. Buddha turned back, looked at the robber in the eye, and the robber became a saint. Because suddenly the robber saw on Buddha's face, for the first time, he was seeing somebody who was not afraid of him, who was full of compassion and sympathy and love on his face. Because Buddha had reached this mystical experience of seeing the divine everywhere. And it was not an intellectual conviction for Buddha, it was a mental experience. Every moment he was experiencing this unity of existence. So it was a reality for him, not just an idea that we get from a book or while listening to a talk. And this robber underwent a complete transformation. He became a saint. That's the story. And he himself became a great champion of the ideal of non-violence. That is the story. That's how the story goes. Now suppose somebody who has got this intellectual conviction that everywhere is the same, who doesn't have a discerning mind as to whom to associate with. What happens? You can imagine the fate of such a person if he confronts a man like this robber. And that's why very often when we associate with people with negative ideas, it is very harmful to the spiritual struggle going on within. Our conflicts, our conflicting thought currents, inner conflicts will increase and become more acute. On the other hand, if we associate with people with similar identical spiritual culture and views, our spiritual life will be enriched. In this battle within, between negative and positive psychological forces, the positive forces will be strengthened and the negative forces will be weakened, and we will enjoy more harmony and more peace. Sometimes this comes as a help in our spiritual life. I can give another example, an illustration of how a person who learned these ideas intellectually fell a victim to the negative mental forces. The same textbook gives another example. An old man, he had committed all kinds of crimes, sinful deeds. He was about to die. It's a mythological story, but with a great, deep spiritual message behind. It also comes in the same Bhagavata Purana. It's called Ajamila Upakhyanam, the story of Ajamila. You need not worry about the name of this person, but the story has got a deep spiritual message behind. Now, this man had led a very indisciplined life, and he was about to die. Naturally, according to mythological beliefs, the satanic forces, the forces from hellfire, came to catch him, to take him to hell. Immediately, God's angels also came there, Vishnu's messengers, servants. Angels came, and the angel drove away the satanic forces and claimed him and took him to heaven. But actually he had led a very sinful life. Now there is a dialogue, a conversation between these angels and the Satan's lieutenants, servants, you may call anything like. The conversation is this: why was it that this man, who had led such a sinful life, who listened only to the negative samskaras, who listened only to the negative voice of his own mind, who led such a sinful life, why was it that he was taken to heaven instead of hell? So the story unfolds. This man, as a boy, had good training, had studied all the great spiritual classics. He became an intellectual scholar who didn't have much of an experience, but intellectually he had grasped all these great spiritual ideas. For the battle within continued, because the battle didn't come to an end. The battle within comes to an end only when the mind catches up with the intellect. When the mind actually gets transformed by actual experience of the great spiritual ideas which intellect grasps and perceives and studies. So this man has studied all the classics. But later on, when he became a young man, he started leading a very indisciplined life. He ill-treated his own parents, he ill-treated his own elders, became a profligate, a scourge and a curse to human society. But he had one son. The son's name was, as a coincidence, the same name by which we call God. Narayana is a name in Sanskrit. Narayanam, Ayanam. Narayana means the supreme destination of the whole humanity. What is that? The supreme goal of human aspirations, human beings. That's the meaning of Narayana. One of the synonyms of God, of Vishnu. His son, he gave the name of God. He gave him the name of God to his son. So when he was about to die, when you die, your natural accumulated tendencies and impressions come to the surface. We cannot be diplomatic at the time of death because mind is totally helpless. Whatever we have accumulated, the totality of all accumulated samskaras and karma phalas, as we call, the fruits of our actions, tendencies, impressions, all of them come to the surface in abstract form at the time of death, when mind is totally helpless. Now, at the time of death, his mind was certainly not thinking about God or spiritual ideas. But he remembered the name of his son, as any father will remember, even a sinful man will remember. And he called his son. Son's name was Narayana, which happened to be the synonym of God in Sanskrit. Now, when he uttered the name of his son, immediately his mind went back to his childhood days. As a child, as a boy, he was brought up as a God-fearing boy by his parents. As I said earlier, he had a deviation from spiritual ethical values only when he became a young man. As a boy, as a child, he was brought up as a very pious, God-fearing child. So, when he uttered the name of his son without really meaning God, suddenly his mind went back to his childhood days. Both were the name, because as a child he was chanting the name of God, which happened to be Narayana. The same name was given to his son. So when he uttered the name of his son, the association came to the surface. Immediately, his mind, which is totally helpless, maybe somewhat repentant, repenting of his previous sinful deeds, suddenly he remembered. And that simple memory saved his life, and God's messengers taught the servants of Satan, Yama is called, the supreme lesson. If one takes the name of God with all sincerity, with all earnestness, at least once in his life, he will be saved. If that spiritual practice is sincere, it goes very deep, it leaves a permanent mark in our mind, and that will help us in our struggle with Him. That's why one way of coming out of this struggle is to go on strengthening spiritual ideas. Our mind, our eyes, and different senses of perception are always active. They go in all directions. So they should be diverted towards spiritually helpful, positive channels, so that this problem of waywardness of the senses of perception, distraction of mind, can be transformed into a positive help. So we may have to make use of different electronic media, print media, books, internet, and so on. They also become great spiritual help if we make use of these media for enriching spiritual ideas. So this is what is called the sublimation of the natural instincts of the senses and mind. But there is a much greater practical benefit of this sublimation. It helps us from the negative thought currents. And also it helps us from the influence of negative ideas. And negative ideas are always associated with negative people. People who transmit negative ideas. In the presence of a great spiritual person, these spiritual ideas naturally transmit into our mind, and our mind gets enriched. In the presence of negative persons, negative ideas also will be transmitted. So, a great monk like Swami Tattwamayananda ji, who worked in America and also in European countries for several years, he gives a very practical solution to this problem. He says, we must always have a psychological filtering mechanism in our mind. Whenever spiritually harmful ideas try to tempt us, appear to overwhelm our mind, we must make an instinctive effort to ward them off, to drive them out. This is one way of keeping ourselves away from negative ideas. For that, all great spiritual teachers insist on one important quality, that is a strong iron will. A strong mind, an iron, a steely heart is as much necessary for succeeding in spiritual life as for succeeding in material life. It's a strong will. This strong will is the strong will of a mystic who is convinced as to the spiritual path that he has to take in his life. And then another very important lesson that many great spiritual seekers gives, the importance of forgetfulness. That is something very interesting. Remembrance is necessary, but the ability to forget is also very essential in spiritual life. Because, as I said earlier, mind is sometimes compared to a lake. You think of a lake which is full of weeds, filth and dirt, different layers of weeds and filth and dirt, and so on. Now we have to clean this lake. We have to remove all the dirt and filth and weeds. What do? We take a long pole, a stick, and we try to stir, and then we try to remove the weeds and dirt and filth. If we sit quiet on the bank of the lake will never become clean. So we must make an effort. So spiritual practices correspond to our effort in cleaning up this mind, which is like a lake. So when we make an attempt, sometimes negative thought currents, not only ideas related to our experiences in this life, but even ideas and tendencies accumulated in previous life may come to the surface. They should be warded away. They should be removed. And that is possible only by accumulating more and more spiritual ideas. Now, another illustration of mind is, the mind is compared to a bag in which all types of tendencies and impressions have accumulated. Some of them are very good, some of them are not so very good. Vedantic psychology says that those tendencies which come as abstract memories, abstract inherited instinctive habits, which cannot be traced to any experience in this life, come from previous life. Suppose certain natural instincts may be good, may not be good, both good and bad, come to the surface and appear to dominate our mind. Those tendencies, those impressions have an origin. They may have originated not in this life, but in some other previous life. Because every impression is the result, is a residual form of some kind of action. Action doesn't necessarily mean physical action. Even a mental thought wave is an action. A speculation is an action. An idea formation is an action, as much as physical action. So all these actions will produce a residual impact, which are called vrittis or vasanas in yoga psychology. So all these impressions have accumulated in their bag. Some of them are very good, some of them are not so very good. So if you go to a library, we see a huge collection of books and magazines. If we can watch our own mind, in which direction does our mind move? If a person's mind naturally flows towards spiritual ideas and he is alone in solitude, he is not watched by others, you can demonstrate your spirituality in the presence of other people. But when you are alone in your own company, if you watch your own mind and watch how your mind functions, in which direction it flows, it moves, you can very easily get a correct estimate of where you stand. Now, if spiritual tendencies are very strong and instinctive and very forceful, it means these tendencies we have accumulated some time in the past. They are very strong. These tendencies are very abstract. They are not associated with any name and form. But tendencies and impressions and memories associated with name and form always have their origin in this life. See, 10 years back, if you were chased by a dog, and if you remember, you can still visualize the dog chasing you. Not a very pleasant memory, but you will have this memory. But if there are people who have a natural instinctive phobia for dogs, sometimes psychologists and psychiatrists sometimes try to explain this phobia in the context of memories or tendencies accumulated in previous life. So multiple personality and schizophrenia are sometimes interpreted in the light of tendencies and impressions gathered in previous life. There are many psychiatrists who have done it. And this trend, mind you, this trend to interpret even psychiatric problems in the light of Vedantic psychology and yoga psychology originated with Swami Vivekananda's appearance in America in 1893. This is another fact which I am not going into details. Now, another very important principle, and that is very relevant when we talk about this inner struggle, battle within. Suppose we struggle very hard to lead a spiritual life. And we do not always succeed. Not many people succeed completely in their first attempt. Now, people sometimes try to interpret spiritual practices as they interpret their normal secular activities. If you run a business, if the business collapses, you may become a bankrupt. So all the savings in the bank, everything gone, nothing is left. You became a homeless man, maybe living just across the Berkeley University in the garden. Now, there you know what happens in material life. If failure means failure of everything, you become totally bankrupt. Is it so in spiritual life too? This question was put by Arjuna to Lord Krishna in the Gita. Arjuna, after listening to a long discourse on spiritual practices, a description of this battle within, rather, puts a question to Krishna. Ayadi Shraddhayo Pedo Yoga Chalida Manasaha Aprapa Yoga Samsiddhim Kam Gadim Krishna Gechadi. Kam Gadim Gechadi is question. What is the destiny? What is the fate of such a person? Which person? A person who tries to meditate but is not very successful. A person who tries to stop drinking and alcoholism but is not very successful. A person who tries to develop the habit of reading holy scriptures every day but doesn't always succeed. A person who tries to desist from doing evil things but totally helpless, he doesn't succeed. And he dies. So Arjuna asked the question, what will be the fate of such a person? Failure, does failure mean total bankruptcy? As in financial transactions? In spiritual life also, a single failure could mean total bankruptcy. That's a question which Arjuna puts to Krishna. Kachino bhaya vibrashtas chinnabhamiva nasyadi apradishto mahabaho vimudho brahmanapadi. So Arjuna asked a very practical question. I didn't try to make money. I tried to meditate. So I could not make money. I tried to meditate. I did not succeed in meditative life. And I also did not succeed in making money. So both secular and spiritual life lost. Ubhaya vibrashta means losing both the world. Neither a luxurious worldly life nor an enlightened spiritual life. Is that going to be the fate of spiritual seekers? A terrible fate. If you have got only one life, and if you have got only one chance, and if the end of the journey, if you are straight away destined to hellfire, then what a terrible thing. If everything ends in the crematorium or in hellfire, and if you have got only one life, then life is a terrible thing. If we look upon our life only as a physical phenomenon that ends in the cemetery or crematorium or in hellfire, spiritually speaking, hellfire, physically speaking, in the crematorium. Is that the end of the journey? There is nothing beyond? Krishna says no. In fact, that's a great promise which is enshrined in this great answer. It comes in the 6th chapter. So Krishna says, Partha naiveha namutra vinashas tasya vidyati nahi kalyanakrit kaschit durgadim tada gacchati. The answer contains a great promise and gives us a great expectation relief. Krishna says, if you make at least one effort to lead a spiritual life in this life, that will not be lost. If you deposit $1 in the bank spirituality, that $1 will remain in your account next life. If you meditate for half an hour in this life, if you just think one noble spiritual thought in this life, need not do physical spiritual exercise, but at least one noble thought, sincerely, if you think, that will create a spiritual asset, a spiritual deposit in the spiritual bank. And the next life, you can start from that point. So nothing is lost, you are never late. That is the message of Yoga and Vedanta. So this struggle, this battle within can be looked upon, can be witnessed as a witness without becoming a combatant engaged in battle. We can watch ourselves to the inner struggle that is going on within and constantly try to enrich our spiritual deposit. Spare time, whenever you get free time, read some holy books, meet some holy men or holy women, or go to the solitude of your own room, in your own home, take a good book, read, and think one noble spiritual thought. That will create an eternal spiritual bank deposit. So that's why Swami Vivekananda made a very grand statement in one of his lectures. It's got a great import. He says, if one man goes into a cave and thinks 5 noble thoughts and dies, those 5 noble thoughts won't be lost for posterity. Those good thoughts will become his spiritual asset, and those thoughts will remain in the air, and they will enrich a spiritual environment. They will enrich the spiritual culture around the world. So every effort, mental effort, intellectual effort, physical effort, can be given a spiritual orientation. That will help us to lead a life in which the secular and spiritual merge into one. So that every act becomes an act of worship, every thought becomes a meditation, and the whole life becomes something that we can enjoy, not in a material sense, in a truly spiritual sense. That is why I can conclude by reference to one great verse in the same Purana which I mentioned, Nityotsavam bhavatyesham nityasri nityamangalam. For a spiritual seeker, every moment is an occasion for enjoying blissfulness. I am not using the term happiness or enjoyment, because these terms have got some very unfortunate connotations in modern life. So I am trying to use the word blissfulness, which goes beyond all this. So for a spiritual seeker, every word becomes a prayer, every moment, every act becomes an act of worship, and every thought becomes an act of meditation. Every moment in his life or her life becomes an occasion for the experience of spiritual blissfulness. Thank you. Namaskar.